Judge Michael Bennett's polished leather shoes echoed through the marble corridors of the downtown courthouse as he made his way to his chambers. At 45, he had earned a reputation as one of the city's most respected judges, known for his unwavering commitment to justice and careful deliberation of each case. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the antique wooden desk he'd inherited from his predecessor. As he settled into his leather chair, his assistant, Sarah Miller, brought in his usual morning coffee and a stack of case files for the day. "Good morning, Your Honor," Sarah said, placing the steaming cup on his desk. "You have 15 cases today, mostly routine matters." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "There's one case that might interest you. An elderly woman with a minor infraction. She's been here since dawn, asking specifically about you." Michael raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of his coffee. In his 15 years on the bench, he'd learned that there was no such thing as a truly routine day in court. Every case, no matter how small, carried its own weight of human stories and consequences. He opened the first file, scanning the details while adjusting his reading glasses. The morning light caught the silver frame on his desk, a photograph of his late mother, Elizabeth Bennett, holding him as a baby. Her kind eyes and warm smile were among his few memories of her, as she passed away when he was only 8. His father had rarely spoken about her after her death, creating a void of family history that Michael had learned to live with but never truly accepted. The courthouse began to buzz with activity as lawyers, defendants, and court officers filtered in for the day's proceedings. Michael took pride in running an efficient courtroom, maintaining the perfect balance between thoroughness and expediency. He had built his career on being fair and impartial, never allowing personal feelings to cloud his judgment. As he donned his black robes, straightening them before the mirror, he reflected on the path that had led him here. Growing up in an all-white suburb, attending law school, and eventually becoming a judge, his life had followed a predictable trajectory of privilege and hard work. Yet sometimes, in quiet moments like these, he felt an inexplicable emptiness, as if a crucial piece of his story remained untold. "Your Honor," Sarah interrupted his thoughts. "The bailiff says they're ready for you." Michael nodded, gathering his composure. He took one last look at his mother's photograph, a habit he'd developed over the years. Today, something about her smile seemed different, almost knowing, as if she held secrets he was yet to discover. "Let's begin," he said, picking up his gavel. As he walked toward his courtroom, he had no idea that the elderly woman waiting in the gallery would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself, his family, and the very foundations of his identity. This ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become the day that would rewrite his entire life story. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 237 opened before him, and Judge Michael Bennett stepped onto the bench, ready to dispense justice in a world that was about to become far more complex than he could ever imagine. The morning proceeded with its usual parade of cases until the clerk called out, "Case number 247, Martha Thompson." The elderly woman rose slowly from her seat in the back of the courtroom, her silver hair neatly styled, wearing a pressed floral dress that spoke of careful preparation for this day. As Martha approached the podium, Judge Bennett noticed something unusual about her demeanor. Unlike most defendants who appeared nervous or defensive, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded attention. Her eyes, warm and knowing, fixed directly on him with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, reviewing her file, "you're here today for—" His voice trailed off as she smiled, a familiar smile that tugged at distant memories he couldn't quite grasp. It reminded him of summer afternoons and the scent of jasmine, fragments of childhood memories he'd almost forgotten. "Yes, Your Honor," Martha replied, her voice rich and melodious, carrying traces of a southern accent. "I understand why I'm here, but if you'll permit me, I have something important to share with the court." She reached into her handbag, her hands steady despite their age. The bailiff stepped forward, but Judge Bennett waved him back. Something about this woman's presence demanded attention, deserved respect. He found himself studying her features, the arch of her eyebrows, the way she held her head high, the gentle crinkles around her eyes when she smiled. Each detail sparked an odd sense of recognition. "Mrs. Thompson, while I appreciate your attention to detail, we should first address the matter at hand," he said, maintaining his professional demeanor despite his growing curiosity. The citation indicates. "Michael," she said softly, but her voice carried through the hushed courtroom. "That's what your mother wanted to name you. She told me before you were born." The gavel nearly slipped from his hand. Nobody in the courthouse knew that story. How his mother had insisted on naming him Michael against his father's wishes. It was a private detail, one of the few personal stories he had of his mother. Judge Bennett felt the color drain from his face as Martha continued to gaze at him with those knowing eyes. The courtroom seemed to fade away, and suddenly he was looking at his mother's photograph again, but this time seeing it with new eyes. The similarities between Martha's smile and his mother's were undeniable. "Your Honor," his clerk whispered, "would you like to take a brief recess?" The judge gripped the edge of his bench, steadying himself. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air between him and Martha. The other attendees in the courtroom sensed the shifting atmosphere, the crackle of revelation about to break. "Mrs. Thompson," he managed to say, his judicial facade cracking slightly, "perhaps we should continue this discussion in my chambers." He turned to his clerk. "Please clear the remainder of this morning's docket." As Martha nodded and turned to follow the bailiff toward his chambers, Judge Bennett caught a glimpse of a gold locket around her neck, identical to the one in his mother's photograph, the one he'd always wondered about. In that moment, he knew his life was about to change forever, and the truth he'd never known he was missing was finally ready to be revealed. In the privacy of his chambers, Martha Thompson sat across from Judge Bennett, her hands resting on a weathered leather purse in her lap. The morning sun cast a gentle glow through the window, illuminating the dust particles dancing between them like fragments of suspended time. "Before I show you what I brought," Martha began, her voice steady but gentle, "I want you to know that your mother, Sarah, was the kindest soul I ever knew. She wanted to tell you everything, but fate had other plans." Judge Bennett watched as she carefully opened her purse and removed an envelope, its edges soft from years of handling. His heart pounded as she withdrew a photograph. Its colors faded to sepia tones that spoke of a different era. "This was taken at our grandmother's house in Georgia, summer of 1965, Martha said, passing him the photograph. "Your mother was 16, and I was 17. Michael's hands trembled as he took the photo. There, on a white-painted porch swing, sat two teenage girls, their shoulders touching, their smiles radiant with youth and shared secrets. One was unmistakably his mother, her blonde hair catching the sunlight, her familiar smile frozen in time. The other was a young Martha, her dark skin glowing with vitality, wearing a matching sundress. We were raised separately, but we found ways to be sisters," Martha continued, watching his face carefully. "Your grandfather, William Stone, was my father too. He had two families, one public, one hidden. But Sarah, your mother, she never saw me as hidden. To her, I was just her sister." The judge stared at the photograph, noticing details that made his vision blur with tears. The girls wore identical lockets, the same one he'd spotted around Martha's neck in the courtroom. Their hands were clasped together, defying the social norms of their time. The casual intimacy of their pose spoke of a deep bond that transcended the rigid boundaries of their era. "Every Sunday," Martha went on, her voice soft with memories, "Sarah would sneak away to visit me. We'd sit on that swing for hours, sharing dreams, planning futures we hoped would be different from our present. She was determined that one day we wouldn't have to hide our relationship." Michael traced his finger over his mother's young face, seeing in it the same determination he'd inherited. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" he whispered, although he already knew the answer. "She fell ill so suddenly," Martha replied, reaching across to place her hand over his. "I was there in the hospital, but I had to pretend to be the cleaning lady just to say goodbye to my own sister, your father." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He thought it best to keep the family history buried." The weight of unspoken years hung between them as judge and aunt studied each other's faces, seeing the shadows of Sarah in their features, her smile in Martha's eyes, her determination in Michael's jaw. The morning light shifted, casting new patterns across the old photograph that had finally brought truth into the light. "I've waited 37 years to meet you properly, nephew," Martha said, squeezing his hand. "Your mother made me promise to watch over you from afar. But now it's time you knew your whole family story." Martha opened her purse once more, this time retrieving a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear, elegant cursive that Michael instantly recognized as his mother's. "Sarah wrote to me every week," Martha explained, carefully untying the ribbon. "Even after she married your father, even after you were born. These letters were our lifeline, our way of keeping our sisterhood alive when we couldn't be together openly." Michael selected one letter from the middle of the stack, dated June 1979, the year before his mother passed away. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. "Dearest Martha, Michael took his first steps today. You should have seen him. So determined, just like you. Sometimes when he sets his jaw a certain way, I see our father in him, but his heart is pure like yours. How I wish I could bring him to meet his aunt, to know the other half of his family, to understand the richness of his heritage. The doctors say the treatments aren't working as hoped, and time grows short. Promise me to watch over him when I'm gone. From a distance if you must, but watch over him. Someday when the world is ready, when he's ready, share our story with him. Help him understand that love knows no boundaries, that family is more than what the world can see. Your loving sister, Sarah." Tears fell onto the aged paper before Michael realized he was crying. Martha reached over with a tissue, her own eyes glistening with memories. "I kept my promise," she said softly. "I was there at your high school graduation, sitting in the back. I attended your law school commencement too. When you were appointed as judge, I cut out every newspaper article. I've watched you grow into someone Sarah would have been so proud of." Michael looked up from the letter, dozens of memories suddenly shifting into new focus. "The flowers," he whispered. "Every year on Mom's birthday, there were always fresh flowers on her grave. That was you." Martha nodded, pulling out another letter. "She loved gardenias. We used to dream of having a garden filled with them someday." She paused, collecting herself. "When I saw my name on today's docket in your courtroom, I knew it was finally time. The world has changed enough, and you're strong enough now to handle the truth." Judge Bennett stood up, walking to his window. The courthouse square below bustled with life. People of all colors walking together, something his mother and aunt could only dream of in their youth. He thought about all his years on the bench, dealing justice without knowing his own family's struggle for recognition and respect. "Aunt Martha," he said, turning back to her, the word feeling both strange and right on his tongue. "I need to know everything. Not just about Mom, but about you, about our family, about how you managed to keep loving in a world that tried to keep you apart." Martha smiled, patting the stack of letters. "That's why I brought these. Each one is a piece of our story, of your story. Are you ready to hear it all?" Michael pulled his chair closer, the morning's court docket forgotten. Today, justice would wait. Today was for family, for truth, for healing wounds he never knew he carried. That evening, Judge Michael Bennett sat alone in his study at home, surrounded by case files from the past decade of his career. Each manila folder represented lives he'd impacted, decisions he'd made, and justice he'd dispensed. But now, every judgment seemed to require a second look through newly opened eyes. He picked up a framed photo from his desk, his judicial inauguration day. In the background of the crowd, barely visible but unmistakably there, stood Martha Thompson, his aunt, silently witnessing another milestone in his life. How many other moments had she been present for, standing in the shadows of his achievements? His computer screen glowed with the case histories he'd been reviewing since returning home. James Carter, a young black man he'd sentenced to 6 months for a minor offense. Had he been too harsh? Sarah Williams, a single mother given a heavy fine instead of community service. Could he have shown more understanding? The weight of these decisions pressed against his conscience with new urgency. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Standing at his door was Martha, holding a worn leather album and a dish covered in foil. "I thought you might be hungry," she said with a knowing smile. "Your mother used to say nobody could think straight on an empty stomach." Over plates of Martha's homemade soul food recipes, she explained that their grandmother had taught both sisters in secret late-night kitchen sessions. They opened the album together. Each page revealed another layer of his hidden heritage. Family picnics held in secluded parks, holiday celebrations conducted in whispers, achievements celebrated in the safety of shadows. "Your mother," Martha said, pointing to a picture of Sarah standing proudly in her nursing uniform, "believed that understanding comes from walking in others' shoes. That's why she became a nurse, to help everyone, regardless of their background." Michael pushed his plate away, standing to pace the room. "All these years on the bench, I thought I was being fair, impartial. But how can any judgment be truly impartial when we don't acknowledge our own blind spots?" Martha watched him with gentle understanding. "Child, recognizing our blind spots is the first step to true justice. Your mother knew that. It's why she married your father, despite his family's objections. It's why she kept writing to me, even when it put her at risk." He stopped at his bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines of law books that suddenly seemed inadequate. "I need to do better," he said firmly, "not just in the courtroom, but in understanding the complexities of every life that comes before me." "That's your mother speaking," Martha smiled. "She always said that justice without empathy is just rules on paper." Michael returned to the table, picking up a photograph of his mother and Martha as teenagers, their arms around each other, laughing at a joke lost to time. "Help me," he said softly. "Help me understand all the stories I should have known, all the perspectives I've been missing." Martha reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "That's why I'm here, nephew. It's time for your education to begin again, but this time with the whole truth of who you are and where you come from." Outside, the sun was setting on the first day of Michael's new understanding of justice, family, and the complex tapestry of human experience that no law book could fully capture. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, Judge Michael Bennett stood nervously on the porch of Martha's modest 2-story home in the historic district. The garden bursted with gardenias, his mother's favorite flowers, their sweet scent filling the air with memories he never knew he had. Martha opened the door before he could knock, wearing an apron dusted with flour. "Right on time," she smiled warmly. "Everyone's so excited to meet you." The words "everyone" echoed in his mind as she led him through her home, filled with photographs he'd never seen and faces he'd never known existed. In the spacious backyard, about 30 people gathered around tables decorated with blue and white checkered cloths. Children played tag between the adults' legs, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. As he stepped onto the back porch, the casual chatter quieted, and all eyes turned to him. Martha squeezed his hand and addressed the crowd. "Family, this is Sarah's boy, my nephew, Michael." A tall man who shared Martha's eyes stepped forward first. "I'm James, Martha's son, your cousin." His handshake was firm, friendly, and carried none of the formality Michael was used to receiving as a judge. One by one, they came forward, cousins, their children, family friends who'd kept their secret for decades. Each person carried a story, a connection to his mother that he'd never known. His cousin Grace had his mother's laugh. Young Marcus, a third cousin, had the same determined chin that he saw in his own mirror every morning. An elderly woman in a floral dress approached him last, leaning on a cane. "I'm your grandmother, Rose's best friend," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. I was there the day Sarah and Martha first met, when they discovered they were sisters. Those girls forged a bond that even the hardest times couldn't break. Michael found himself seated at a table laden with family recipes, dishes his mother had once enjoyed at secret gatherings just like this one. Martha's famous peach cobbler, Cousin James's barbecue ribs, and dozens of other dishes that carried decades of family tradition. Your mother used to sneak these recipes home, Martha explained, passing him a plate of cornbread. She practiced making them in secret, wanting to pass down our family's traditions to you someday. She'd be so happy to see you here, finally knowing your whole family. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, children gathered around Michael, eager to hear stories about being a judge. He found himself relaxing, leaving behind the formal persona he wore in court. Here he wasn't Judge Bennett. He was simply Michael, Sarah's boy, Martha's nephew, part of a family tapestry far richer and more complex than he'd ever imagined. We've kept photo albums of you growing up, his cousin Grace shared, showing him pictures he'd never seen. His high school graduation captured from a distance, his first day as a lawyer snapped discreetly, his judicial ceremony watched by proud family members he never knew were there. As the day drew to a close, Martha gathered everyone for a family photo. Michael stood in the center, next to his Aunt Martha, surrounded by faces that now felt familiar, connected by bonds that had waited generations to be acknowledged. "Welcome home," Martha whispered, squeezing his hand as the camera flashed. And for the first time in his life, Michael truly understood what home meant, not just a place, but a belonging that transcended time, prejudice, and silence. 1 month after the family gathering, Judge Michael Bennett's courtroom had subtly transformed. The changes weren't visible in the physical space. The same wooden panels lined the walls. The same American flag stood proud beside his bench. The transformation lay in the judge himself and how he viewed the faces before him. That morning, a young mother stood before him, charged with a minor offense. Instead of immediately reviewing her file, he looked at her, really looked, seeing not just a defendant, but a person whose story deserved to be heard. He thought of his mother and Martha, of hidden stories and second chances. "Your Honor," the woman began, her voice trembling. "I know what I did was wrong, but my daughter was sick, and I couldn't miss another day of work." Michael glanced at the framed photograph now sitting on his bench, the family photo from Martha's gathering. Carefully positioned, so only he could see it, it served as a daily reminder of the complexity of human lives and the importance of understanding before judgment. During the lunch recess, Martha visited his chambers, bringing her weekly delivery of cookies for his court staff, a tradition she'd started since their reunion. "I watched you this morning," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Sarah would be proud of how you're handling cases now." Michael smiled, offering her a cup of coffee. "I've been thinking about starting a community outreach program," he shared, "something to help people understand their rights, get legal assistance before they end up in court. Mom was all about prevention rather than punishment, wasn't she?" "She was," Martha nodded. "That's why she became a nurse. She believed in healing, not hurting." She paused, pulling out an old journal from her bag. "I found this in my attic. It's Sarah's diary from when she was in nursing school. She wrote about her dreams for the future, including her hopes for you." As Michael read his mother's words, written decades ago, he felt her wisdom guiding his current path. She had written about a future where people would be judged by their circumstances and potential, not just their actions or appearance. Later that afternoon, he called a meeting with his fellow judges. Standing before them in the conference room, he shared his proposal for the community outreach program. "We have an opportunity," he explained, "to make justice more accessible, more understanding, and ultimately more effective." Some of his colleagues looked skeptical, but others nodded in agreement. Judge Sarah Martinez, his longtime friend, spoke up first. "It's about time we bridge the gap between this bench and the community we serve. I'm in." As the day drew to a close, Michael sat in his chambers, reviewing his notes for tomorrow's cases. Each file now represented more than just a case number. It represented a story, a life, a possibility for understanding and growth. His phone buzzed with a message from Martha. Family dinner this Sunday. The young ones want to hear more stories about their Aunt Sarah. Michael smiled, typing his reply. His mother and Martha had kept their sisterhood alive through secret letters and hidden meetings. Now he could honor their legacy by bringing that same spirit of understanding and connection into his courtroom, one case at a time. As he gathered his things to leave, he straightened the family photo on his bench, his mother's and Martha's smiles reminding him that true justice begins with seeing the humanity in every person who stands before him. 1 year later, the downtown courthouse buzzed with activity as people gathered for the inauguration of its new Community Justice Center. Judge Michael Bennett stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd before him. In the front row sat Martha, elegant in a blue dress, wearing the gold locket that had once matched his mother's. Today, Michael began, his voice carrying across the courthouse steps. We're not just opening a building. We're opening doors to understanding, bridges to justice, and pathways to second chances. He paused, his eyes meeting Martha's. This center was inspired by two remarkable sisters who taught me that justice without compassion is incomplete. The red ribbon stretched across the entrance rippled in the spring breeze. Behind it, the words Sarah Bennett Memorial Community Justice Center gleamed in gold letters. The building would house free legal clinics, counseling services, and education programs, all designed to help people before they reach the courtroom. After the ceremony, Martha led Michael to a quiet corner of the new center. There's something your mother wanted you to have, she said, removing her locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of the two sisters as young girls, and opposite it, a small piece of paper tucked tightly in the frame. With trembling fingers, Michael unfolded the note written in his mother's handwriting. To my son, may you always see with your heart as well as your eyes. Love bridges all divides. Love, Mom. The afternoon sun streamed through the center's windows as families filled out assistance forms. Law students provided free consultations, and community members shared their stories. Michael watched as Martha spoke with a young mother, offering the same gentle wisdom she'd once shared in secret with her sister. His phone buzzed. A message from Cousin James. Family reunion this weekend. Marcus wants to show his Uncle Judge the law school acceptance letter. Michael smiled, remembering the shy teenager who'd peppered him with legal questions at their first family gathering. Later, in his chambers, Michael added a new photograph beside the old ones. The ribbon-cutting ceremony, with him and Martha standing together, their smiles matching those of their younger selves in the old porch swing photo. A knock at his door revealed his clerk. Your Honor, Mrs. Thompson's community mediation program is ready to begin. The participants are waiting. In the mediation room, Martha sat with two families, her presence bringing the same calming wisdom that had helped bridge a family divided by secrets and prejudice. Michael observed from the doorway, seeing his mother's spirit alive in the way Martha brought people together, helped them understand each other, and found paths to reconciliation. As the sun set over the courthouse, Michael and Martha walked through the garden planted in Sarah's memory. Gardenias bloomed along the path, their fragrance a sweet reminder of secrets now brought to light, of wounds healed by truth, of justice tempered by love. You know, Martha said, touching a gardenia blossom, Sarah always said that love would win in the end. She just needed to make sure the pieces were in place. She smiled at her nephew. You were the final piece, Michael. Through you, her love for both her families can finally live in the light. Together, aunt and nephew, black and white, past and present, they walked through the garden, their shadows merging in the evening light, a living testament to the power of truth, the strength of family, and the enduring victory of love over prejudice.